The waitress gave money to a man in old, torn clothes so he could eat, never imagining he was a millionaire. When she found out, what he did for her left her speechless. The sky over Chicago was a vast canvas of gray, heavy clouds rolling in as the rain pattered against the windows of Elliot's diner, a small, cozy restaurant nestled between towering buildings. The late afternoon rush had dwindled, leaving a few regulars sipping their coffee while Christina wiped down the counter, humming softly to herself. She had worked here for years, long enough to know most of the customers by name. Her life was simple, repetitive even, but she found comfort in it, at least until the end of the month, when the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table reminded her that life was anything but easy. The bell above the door jingled, and Christina glanced up. A man stepped inside, shaking off the rain from his tattered coat. He was in his 50s, his salt and pepper hair unkempt, his beard thick and unruly. His eyes, however, were what caught Christina's attention, deep-set, tired, yet observant. As if he were studying the world around him with careful curiosity, he didn't sit at the counter like most did. Instead, he took a corner booth, away from the warmth of conversation and the clatter of silverware. Christina watched as he sat motionless, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the table. Minutes passed and he didn't order. He barely moved, except to glance at the steaming plates being served to other customers. His fingers tapped against the wood of the table, an unconscious movement, perhaps a distraction from the hunger gnawing at him. Christina hesitated. She had seen people down on their luck before, but something about this man tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, not like someone resigned to hardship, but like someone who had once known a different life. She grabbed a menu and approached his table, offering a gentle smile. "Can I get you something?" The man lifted his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. There was no defensiveness, no embarrassment, just quiet acceptance. I don't have any money," he admitted, his voice low, almost as if he hated saying the words out loud. Christina felt a lump form in her throat. She had barely enough to make it through the week, but something inside her refused to ignore his situation. Without overthinking it, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out $35. The last bit of cash she had saved to pay a past-due bill. She placed the money on the table. "Here, that should cover a meal." The man blinked in surprise. "You don't even know me," he said, as if trying to make sense of her kindness. She smiled. "You look like you need it more than I do." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his fingers hesitating over the money, as if it were something fragile, something that might disappear if he touched it. Then, slowly, he picked it up, his eyes shining with something Christina couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he murmured. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to." She waved it off. "Just enjoy your meal." She walked away before he could protest further, heading back behind the counter. She expected him to order something modest, maybe a simple sandwich or a bowl of soup. But when he finally placed an order, he asked for a full meal: steak, potatoes, vegetables, and a warm slice of pie. As the kitchen prepared his food, Christina stole glances at him. He ate slowly when his plate arrived, savoring every bite, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. But more than that, she noticed how he watched everything around him. The waitresses chatting, the cooks moving in sync, the regulars exchanging laughter. There was something about him, something she couldn't put into words. When he finished his meal, he stood, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. Before stepping out into the rain, he turned back and met Christina's gaze. "I won't forget this," he said simply. Then, he was gone. Christina let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Who was that?" one of the waitresses, Lisa, asked, nudging her elbow. "I don't know," Christina admitted. "Just someone who needed a little kindness." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You just gave him your own money." "It was just $35, Lisa scoffed. $35 that you were going to use for your bills." Christina shrugged, trying to ignore the gnawing worry in her gut. She had done the right thing. She had to believe that, because if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that life had a way of returning what you gave, whether good or bad. And maybe, just maybe, this small act of kindness would come back to her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Christina pushed open the door to Elliot's diner, letting in a gust of crisp autumn air as she stepped inside. The warm aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries greeted her, along with the familiar clatter of plates and muffled conversations of early morning customers. It was just another day, another long shift, and yet, something about last night still lingered in her mind. She had thought about the man she helped, his tired eyes, the way he hesitated before accepting her money, and the quiet, almost knowing way he had thanked her before disappearing into the rain. She wondered where he had gone, if he had somewhere to sleep, or if that meal was the only real food he'd had in days. Shaking the thought away, she tied her apron around her waist and headed behind the counter. There was no point in dwelling on it. She had done what she could, and that was that. The morning rush came and went, the usual wave of regulars filling the booths and counter stools. Christina moved between tables with practiced ease, pouring coffee, taking orders and exchanging pleasantries. It was only when things quieted down that she finally had a chance to catch her breath. That was when the diner's door swung open again. A man stepped inside. Christina froze. It was him, but he looked completely different. Gone were the tattered coat and the unkempt beard. Instead, he was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, his hair neatly combed back, and his face clean-shaven, revealing strong, defined features. His eyes, however, were the same, piercing, observant, and unreadable. He stepped forward with quiet confidence, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he moved toward her. Behind him, two men in black suits followed at a respectful distance, their expressions impassive. The diner had gone silent. Lisa, who had been wiping down the counter, nudged Christina lightly. Is that the same guy from last night?" she whispered under her breath. Christina barely managed to nod. The man stopped directly in front of her, looking at her with the same intensity as the night before. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm yet firm. Christina swallowed. I'm working right now. I won't take much of your time." He gestured to a booth near the window. "Please." Something in his tone made it impossible to refuse. She glanced at Lisa, who widened her eyes as if to say, "What the hell is going on?" Christina didn't have an answer. Taking a deep breath, she untied her apron and followed the man to the booth, sliding into the seat across from him. His presence was commanding, yet not intimidating. Up close, she could see the fine details of his expensive suit, the gold cufflinks glinting under the diner's dim lighting. He wasn't just wealthy, he was someone powerful. "I never introduced myself properly," he said, leaning forward slightly. "My name is Timothy Williams." The name rang a bell, but Christina couldn't immediately place it. "I know this must seem strange," he continued, his voice measured. "Yesterday I came in here looking like a man with nothing, and you, without hesitation, helped me. You gave me your own money, expecting nothing in return." Christina shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't a big deal. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "To you, maybe not, but to me, it was everything." She frowned. "Why?" Timothy exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "I disappeared from the public eye years ago. I built an empire, but in doing so, I lost faith in people. The more wealth I accumulated, the more I realized how many only saw me for what I could give them. I became surrounded by opportunists, by people who wore masks of kindness only when they wanted something from me." He paused, watching her reaction. "So I left it all behind. I wanted to see if there was still genuine kindness in the world, if there were people who would help a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do." Christina's breath caught in her throat. "That's why you..." She trailed off, suddenly understanding. "Suddenly," he nodded. "I've done this before. I've gone to different places, blending in with those who have nothing, just to see who would notice, who would care. And you, Christina, you were the first person in years to show me kindness without knowing who I was." She didn't know what to say. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. "So, what now?" she finally asked. "I want to repay that kindness," he said simply. "Not just with words, but with action." Christina stiffened. "Look, I didn't do it expecting anything in return. I know, that's what makes you different." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the table in front of her. "But that doesn't mean I won't do it anyway." She hesitated before picking it up. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a check for $10,000. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the number, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. This has to be a mistake," she stammered. "I can't take this." "You can," Timothy said. "And you will." Her head spun. With this money, she could finally catch up on bills, give Isaac the life he deserved, maybe even take a breath for the first time in years. But was this real? Could she really accept something like this? She looked up at Timothy, searching for some sign that this was a trick, but all she saw was sincerity. "I don't expect anything from you, Christina," he assured her. "This is just the beginning. If you let me, I want to do more. More." Before she could respond, the bell above the diner's door jingled again. She turned to see a familiar little boy walking in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Isaac. He spotted her and grinned. "Mom," he called, running over. Christina's throat tightened. She looked at her son, then back at the check in her hands. Her world was about to change forever. Christina's hands tightened around the check as Isaac plopped into the seat beside her. Oblivious to the storm raging inside her mind, $10,000. It was more money than she had seen in one place in years. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear her son's voice as he chatted excitedly about his day at school. Timothy, ever observant, watched her carefully, giving her space to process. He made no move to push the envelope back toward her. Instead, he studied her reaction, waiting patiently. "Mom?" Isaac tugged on her sleeve, his bright eyes darting to the check in her hands. "What's that?" Christina swallowed hard, forcing a smile. She hesitated. "It's just something from a friend." Isaac's brow furrowed, but he didn't question it further. Instead, he turned his attention to the well-dressed man sitting across from them. "Who's he?" Timothy smiled, his posture immediately relaxing. "I'm Timothy, a friend of your mom's." The boy tilted his head, as if studying him. "You look fancy." Christina let out a breath of laughter, despite the tension still gripping her chest. "Isaac?" "No, it's all right," Timothy chuckled. "I suppose I do look a little different from the last time your mom saw me." Isaac blinked. "Wait, have you been here before?" Timothy nodded. "I was here last night. Your mom helped me when I needed it." The boy's eyes widened. "Oh, that's what she does. She helps everybody, even when we don't have much." He said it so matter-of-factly that Christina's throat tightened. Timothy's gaze flickered back to her, his expression softening. "Yes, she does." Christina felt trapped between gratitude and unease. She didn't want Isaac to get the wrong idea, to think that just because someone was kind to you, they owed you something in return. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the way Timothy looked at them, as if he saw something more than just a struggling waitress and her son. With a deep breath, she folded the check and slid it back across the table. "I can't take this," she said, her voice firm. "It's too much." Timothy exhaled, as if he had expected this. He didn't look offended, only thoughtful. "Christina, I understand why you're hesitant, but this isn't charity. This is gratitude. And I meant what I said. I want to do more." She shook her head. Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I'm not just handing you money and walking away. I want to give you something that will last, something you can build for yourself and for Isaac." Christina frowned. "What are you talking about?" Timothy leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I want to give you your own restaurant." Silence. For a moment, Christina thought she had misheard him. The words were so surreal, so completely out of place in her world, that they didn't register immediately. When they did, she laughed, a short, incredulous laugh. "You're joking." "I'm not." Her smile faded. "Timothy, this is crazy. I barely make ends meet waiting tables. I don't know the first thing about running a restaurant." "You know more than you think," he countered. "You've spent years in this industry. You know how to treat customers, how to keep things moving, how to handle pressure, the business side. I'll help with that. But the heart of a restaurant, that's you." Christina felt her pulse quicken. The very idea of it was overwhelming. It wasn't just the money, it was the responsibility, the risk. "I can't just..." She shook her head. "I have bills, Isaac's school. What if it fails? What if I mess it all up?" Timothy smiled, but there was something knowing in his eyes, as if he had been in this exact position before. "Christina, I built my empire from nothing. Do you think I never had doubts? Do you think I never failed?" She didn't answer. "I see potential in you," he continued. "And more than that, I see someone who deserves a chance." Christina's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. It was too much, too fast, too good to be true. And yet, she thought about her endless shifts, about how exhausted she was every night, about how many times she had told Isaac that things would get better, even when she wasn't sure how. She thought about what it would mean to finally have control over her own life. She met Timothy's gaze, searching for deception, for strings attached. She found none. Her throat felt tight. "I need time to think," Timothy nodded. "Of course, I don't expect an answer right away, but I do want you to see the place before you decide." "The place?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a key, placing it on the table between them. "There's a small restaurant a few blocks from here," he said. "It's been closed for a while, but it has potential. I think it could be something special in the right hands." Christina stared at the key as if it held the weight of the world. This wasn't just some impulsive act of generosity. This was a life-changing decision, and for the first time in a long time, she had a real choice. Isaac, still unaware of the gravity of the moment, swung his legs under the booth and grinned. "Mom, you could have your own restaurant. That would be so cool." Christina let out a shaky breath. "Yeah," she murmured, fingers brushing over the key. "It would." The key sat on Christina's kitchen counter, untouched, as if it carried a weight too heavy for her to bear. She had placed it there the moment she walked through the door, hoping that, somehow, leaving it alone would make the decision easier. It didn't. Isaac had been buzzing with excitement all evening, rattling off ideas about what she could serve in her restaurant. Pancakes with extra syrup, milkshakes in every flavor, maybe even a menu named after him. His enthusiasm was contagious, but Christina's doubts remained that night as she lay awake in bed. Staring at the ceiling, the what-ifs gnawed at her. What if she failed? What if she let Isaac down? What if she ended up worse off than she was now? The next morning, she trudged into Elliot's diner with a heavy heart, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. Lisa was already behind the counter, chatting with a customer, but the moment she spotted Christina, she waved her over. "Okay, spill," Lisa said, pouring a fresh cup of coffee and sliding it toward her. "What's with the zombie look?" Christina sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I just have a lot on my mind." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Does this have anything to do with that rich guy who walked in here yesterday looking like he owned half of Chicago?" Christina hesitated. Lisa was her closest friend, but even saying it out loud felt ridiculous. "He made me an offer," she admitted. Lisa leaned in. "What kind of offer?" Christina hesitated again, then took a deep breath. "He wants to give me a restaurant." Lisa blinked. "Excuse me, I know how it sounds." Christina rushed to explain. "It's not like he's just handing it to me. He believes in me, I guess. Thinks I can make something of it, but Lisa, I don't know. It's crazy, right? Who just gives someone a whole business?" Lisa leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, first of all, yeah, it's insane. But second, and more importantly, why are you acting like this is a bad thing?" Christina looked down at her coffee. "Because it's too much. It doesn't make sense. I don't know how to run a business, Lisa. I can barely afford to fix a leaking faucet in my apartment. How am I supposed to manage an entire restaurant?" Lisa studied her for a moment, then smirked. "Let me ask you something. How long have you been working here?" Christina frowned. "You know that. Almost 10 years. And in those 10 years, who's the one who stays late to help balance the books when the boss screws up? Me. Who knows every regular customer by name, what they like, and how they take their coffee? Me. Who basically runs this place even though she's not the one on the payroll as a manager?" Christina sighed. "Me." Lisa tilted her head. "And you still think you don't know how to run a restaurant?" Christina bit her lip. She had never looked at it that way. Lisa leaned in again, her tone softening. "Look, I get it. It's terrifying. Change always is. But Chris, when was the last time you let yourself dream? Really dream. Not just about making ends meet, but about having something of your own." Christina's chest tightened. Dreaming had never been a luxury she could afford. Her life had always been about survival, "I don't know how to trust this," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust that this isn't just another thing that's going to fall apart." Lisa reached across the counter, squeezing her hand. "Then don't do it for him. Do it for you. Do it for Isaac." Christina nodded. But deep down, the fear still lingered. That afternoon, after finishing her shift, she found herself standing outside the building Timothy had told her about. The restaurant was small, but charming, its windows dusty from months, maybe years, of abandonment. The sign above the door had long since faded, the once vibrant colors now dull and chipped. Her fingers curled around the key in her pocket. Taking a shaky breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was larger than she expected, though it was clear it needed work. The tables were stacked against the wall, the countertops covered in a fine layer of dust. The smell of aged wood and forgotten memories filled the air. She ran her fingers along one of the tables, imagining what this place could look like with a fresh coat of paint, warm lighting, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. For the first time since Timothy had made the offer, she allowed herself to picture it, not as something terrifying, but as something real, something possible. She turned at the sound of footsteps behind her. Timothy stood in the doorway, watching her with that same quiet patience he always had. "You came," he said simply. Christina swallowed. "I had to see it for myself," he nodded, stepping inside. "What do you think?" She hesitated before answering. "It's a lot." Timothy gave her a small smile. "Big dreams usually are." She let out a shaky breath, turning back to the empty space before her. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "You can," Timothy said. "But the real question is, do you want to?" Christina closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of everything settle. The fear, the doubt, the possibility. When she opened them again, she didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time, she wasn't completely sure she wanted to say no. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Christina went through her routine at the diner like a ghost, her mind constantly circling back to the empty restaurant and the key that felt like it burned in her pocket every time she touched it. Isaac's excitement hadn't faded. Every night at dinner, he'd bring up new ideas for the menu, talking about milkshakes and burgers, a kid's corner, even a suggestion that they should have a giant gumball machine at the entrance. His enthusiasm should have reassured her, but instead, it made the pressure feel even heavier. It was one thing to imagine taking the risk. It was another to gamble her son's future on a dream she wasn't even sure she could handle. The fear gnawed at her, but there was something else, something quieter, buried beneath the doubt, a whisper of hope, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, she could have something more. By the end of the week, she couldn't take it anymore. She called Timothy. They met at the restaurant the next morning. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against the counter with his usual composed, unreadable expression. The place still smelled like dust and neglect, but as Christina stepped inside, she realized it didn't look quite as abandoned as it had before. Maybe it was just the way she was seeing it now. Timothy straightened as she walked toward him. "So," she took a deep breath, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I don't want handouts." His lips twitched, almost like he had expected that. "It's not a handout. I want to earn it," she continued, her voice steady. "If I do this, I need to know I worked for it, that it's mine because I built it, not because someone handed it to me." Timothy nodded slowly, considering her words. "Fair enough." Christina hesitated, then exhaled. "Okay." Something flickered in his eyes. "Okay." She swallowed hard. "I'll do it." The words felt like a leap off a cliff, thrilling and terrifying all at once. Timothy's face remained neutral, but there was a warmth in his expression that hadn't been there before. "You won't regret it." She hoped he was right. The next few days moved fast, faster than she had expected. Timothy wasted no time. He had people come in to assess what needed to be done, contractors to fix the electrical issues, deep cleaning crews to bring life back into the place. Christina was swept up in the whirlwind, barely able to catch her breath between work at the diner and meetings at what was soon to be her new restaurant. Lisa's reaction had been a mixture of shock and delight when Christina told her the news. "Jesus, Chris, you don't do small changes, do you?" she had teased, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so damn proud of you." It was a strange feeling, hearing those words, Christina wasn't used to people saying they were proud of her. Even stranger was the way she started feeling about the restaurant itself. In the beginning, it had just been an empty space, a terrifying, uncertain risk. But the more time she spent there, the more she started seeing it differently. She started imagining the tables filled with people, the scent of fresh coffee in the air, the sound of laughter and music. She started imagining what it could be. One afternoon, after another long shift at the diner, she arrived at the restaurant to find Timothy already there, reviewing paperwork. He barely looked up as she walked in, but she caught the slight smirk on his face as he spoke. "You're late." Christina rolled her eyes, dropping her bag onto a chair. "I don't remember signing up for a boss." Timothy finally glanced at her, amusement dancing in his gaze. "Not a boss. A business partner." The word startled her more than she expected. "Partner," he nodded, placing a document in front of her. "I told you this wasn't a handout. If you're doing this, you're doing it with me. I'll invest in the startup costs, help with the initial setup, and guide you through the business side. But the rest, that's all you." Christina stared at the papers. The weight of what she was committing to settled on her chest. But this time, it wasn't just fear. There was something else. Excitement. She picked up a pen, hesitated for only a second, and then signed. Timothy studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Welcome to your new life, Christina." The reality of it all didn't fully hit Christina until she stood in the middle of the restaurant a week later, hands on her hips, surveying what would soon be her new life. The cleaning crew had done wonders. Gone was the layer of dust, the stale air replaced with the fresh scent of citrus polish and newly scrubbed wood. But there was still so much to do. The walls needed repainting, the furniture needed replacing, the kitchen equipment needed upgrading. She had expected this, of course. What she hadn't expected was the strange sensation in her chest, a mixture of excitement and fear battling for dominance. "You're staring at it like it's going to swallow you whole," Timothy's voice came from behind her. Christina turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his usual composed expression softened by something almost amused. She let out a breath. "Feels like it might." He stepped further inside, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. "Change does that, but you're handling it better than most would." Christina crossed her arms, shifting her weight. "Yeah, and how do most people handle it?" Timothy gave her a look. Most people would have run by now. She didn't doubt it. She had considered running herself, more times than she cared to admit. But something kept her anchored here. Maybe it was Isaac's excitement. Maybe it was the way Lisa had hugged her and called her a badass. Or maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen more than just a struggling waitress. She shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. "I'm not most people." Timothy's lips curved just slightly. "No, you're not." He moved past her then, running a hand over the polished wood of the counter as he glanced around. Christina watched him carefully, noting the way his fingers lingered on the surface, the way his eyes took in every corner of the space as if it held some significance to him. "You seem familiar with this kind of thing," she said after a moment. "Restaurants, I mean." Timothy exhaled, a slow, thoughtful breath. "I wasn't always who I am now." Christina raised an eyebrow. "Oh," he looked at her then, something unreadable in his gaze. "A long time ago, before the money, before the business world, I worked in places like this. I used to dream of owning something of my own." Something about the way he said it made Christina pause. "Used to." He glanced away. "Dreams change." Christina studied him. There was something in his voice, something that sounded almost regretful. She hesitated before speaking again. "You said you disappeared from the public eye, that you left it all behind. Why?" Timothy didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair at one of the freshly cleaned tables and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. After a moment, she joined him. "I built everything I have from nothing," he finally said. "I worked my way up, made the right connections, learned how to turn opportunities into success. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. When you have nothing, people look through you. But when you have everything, people only see what they can take from you." Christina's chest tightened. She understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. "I trusted the wrong people," Timothy continued. "I was surrounded by people who claimed to care, But in the end, all they wanted was a piece of what I had built. When I realized that, I walked away. I needed to remind myself what it meant to trust again, to believe in people. Christina swallowed. And did you? His eyes met hers. You're the first person who's made me think maybe I can. The words settled between them. Heavy with unspoken meaning, Christina looked down, tracing patterns on the table with her fingertip. I've been let down before too, she admitted. People make promises, say they'll stick around, but in the end, they leave, or they change. Timothy studied her. Your husband. She nodded. He died 5 years ago. Cancer. We had no savings, no backup plan. Everything we had went to medical bills. After he was gone, it was just me and Isaac. I had to figure everything out on my own. A flicker of something passed over Timothy's expression. Understanding, maybe. You did a hell of a job, he said. Christina let out a breathless laugh. Some days it doesn't feel like it. Then those are the days you have to remind yourself that you kept going, even when it was hard. She looked at him then, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the composed businessman, beyond the mysterious stranger who had walked into her life. She saw someone who understood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Timothy sat back, his expression shifting back to something lighter. Well, now that we've covered the sentimental part of the conversation, let's talk business. Christina smirked. That was sentimental for you. He gave her a dry look. I have a reputation to maintain. She chuckled, shaking her head. All right, business. What's next? Timothy leaned forward. Next, we start making real decisions. Menu, hiring staff, branding. We're turning this place into something great. Christina felt that flicker of fear again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Hope was there too, pushing back against the doubt. She nodded. Okay, let's do it. The days blurred into weeks as the restaurant took shape. Christina had never worked so hard in her life, balancing shifts at the diner, taking care of Isaac, and overseeing every decision about the restaurant. The exhaustion was real, but so was the growing excitement that she tried not to let scare her. The space had transformed completely. The old faded walls were now warm and inviting, painted in a deep, rich color that made the place feel cozy instead of abandoned. The wooden floors gleamed under the soft glow of the new light fixtures, and the scent of fresh varnish still clung to the air. The kitchen, once outdated and barely functional, now boasted brand new stainless steel appliances, ready to handle whatever menu they decided on. Isaac loved coming along whenever she had time to bring him. Every time he walked through the doors, his face would light up with wonder, as if he were stepping into a dream that was slowly becoming real. We need a corner for kids, he declared one evening, twirling in circles in what would soon be the dining area, like a little reading nook or something. Christina, exhausted from a long day of vendor meetings, gave him a tired but amused look. A reading nook? This is a restaurant, not a library. Yeah, but what if parents bring their kids and they get bored? They could have a little space with books and puzzles and stuff, he insisted. It makes sense. Christina shook her head, but she couldn't help but smile. So now you're part of the design team, huh? Isaac grinned. I'm just saying, if we're doing this, we should make it cool. Timothy, who had been quietly reviewing some paperwork at one of the newly installed booths, glanced up. You know, he's not wrong. Christina turned to him with an exasperated look. Not you too. Timothy smirked. A space like that would set us apart from other places in the area. Family-friendly without feeling like a kiddie restaurant. Isaac pumped his fist in victory. See? Timothy gets it. Christina groaned. But deep down, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread in her chest. This wasn't just about a business. This was about creating something meaningful. Not just for her, but for Isaac too. Later that evening, after Isaac had fallen asleep on one of the booths, Christina sat across from Timothy, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. You're handling this better than I expected, he remarked, sipping his third coffee of the night. She let out a dry chuckle. What? You thought I'd run screaming? I thought you'd hesitate more, he admitted. Doubt yourself, she exhaled, tracing the grain of the wooden table with her fingertips. I still do. Timothy studied her, his sharp gaze searching her face. And yet, you're still here. She looked around the restaurant, the restaurant that would soon open under her name. It still felt surreal. "Yeah," she admitted softly. "I am." Timothy nodded, something thoughtful flickering in his expression. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" Christina arched an eyebrow. "You're a billionaire. I don't think I can say no," he chuckled. But there was a weight behind his amusement this time. "Your mother? Did she ever talk about your father?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Christina's fingers tensed against the table. No, not really." She swallowed. She was always vague about it. Said he wasn't in the picture. That he didn't even know I existed. Timothy's expression remained composed, but she caught the way his jaw tightened slightly. "Why do you ask?" she pressed. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. Then, with a shake of his head, he gave a vague response. "Just curious." Christina frowned. It was a lie, or at least not the full truth. She opened her mouth to push further. But before she could, Isaac stirred from his half-sleep, blinking groggily before sitting up. "Mom." His voice was thick with sleep. She immediately turned to him, brushing his hair out of his face. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Isaac yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah? Did we get the jukebox?" Christina laughed. "You're dreaming about the restaurant now." He nodded sleepily. "I still think we need one." Timothy smirked. "I might know a guy." Isaac grinned before letting his head drop back against the seat, eyes already fluttering shut again. Christina let out a small breath, her hand instinctively resting on her son's back, grounding herself in the moment, but her mind was still stuck on Timothy's question. Why would he ask about her father now? Her mother had never spoken much about the man who had helped bring her into the world. It had always been a subject met with silence or vague remarks, like a locked door that Christina had long since stopped trying to open. She had convinced herself it didn't matter. Her mother had been enough, even when things were hard. But Timothy's question had shaken something loose. She glanced at him again, watching the way he stared at the table, lost in thought. She had the strange, unsettling feeling that Timothy Williams wasn't just curious. He was searching for something, and Christina had the eerie sense that whatever he was looking for had everything to do with her. The following days should have been all about the restaurant, but Christina couldn't shake the feeling that Timothy's question about her father had meant something more. She told herself she was imagining things, that maybe he had just been making conversation, but deep down, she knew better. Timothy Williams wasn't the kind of man who asked idle questions. He was deliberate, intentional. Everything he did had a purpose. She tried to push it out of her mind, focusing instead on finalizing the restaurant details. She spent hours poring over menus, sampling dishes with a hired chef, and working with a designer to make sure the space felt warm and inviting. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, but even as she threw herself into the work, the unease lingered. One evening, she found herself sitting alone in the restaurant after everyone had gone for the night. The space was almost ready. Just a few final touches left before the grand opening. She should have been proud, excited even. But instead, her mind kept drifting back to that moment with Timothy. The door creaked open, and she turned to see him stepping inside, his silhouette outlined against the dim streetlights. He was dressed more casually than usual, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his sleeves rolled up. He looked less like the billionaire businessman, and more like someone who belonged in a place like this. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low, almost amused. Christina shook her head, exhaling. "Too much on my mind." Timothy nodded, stepping further into the room. "I figured you looked distracted today." She glanced at him, debating whether or not to ask what had been bothering her. Finally, she took a deep breath. "That question you asked me the other night, about my father. Why did you ask that?" Timothy's expression didn't change immediately, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed just slightly, the way his fingers curled briefly against the back of a chair before he relaxed again. "I told you," he said carefully. "I was just curious." Christina narrowed her eyes. "I don't believe that." Timothy sighed, running a hand through his hair before sitting down at the booth across from her. For the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't before. Hesitation. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he finally said. I've been thinking about some things from my past, and when you mentioned your mother never talked about your father, it struck a chord with me." Christina studied him, her heart beating a little faster. Why? There was a long pause before he spoke again. Because there was someone in my past. Someone I lost touch with a long time ago. Her name was Teresa. A strange sensation curled in Christina's stomach. She didn't move, barely breathed. Teresa, she repeated. Timothy nodded, his gaze unreadable. She was important to me, but circumstances pulled us apart. I never knew what happened to her after that. And now, here I am, decades later, meeting you. The weight of his words settled over her like a thick fog. She felt dizzy, like she was on the verge of understanding something, but the full picture wasn't clear yet. You think, her voice was barely above a whisper, you think my mother was the Teresa you knew? Timothy didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said enough. Christina's mind reeled. It wasn't possible, was it? Her mother had never spoken much about the past, had always kept certain details vague. Could Timothy really be talking about the same Teresa? She felt like she was falling into something bigger than herself, something she had never expected. Timothy exhaled. I don't know for sure, but I need to find out. Christina stared at him, her heart pounding. If he was right, if he really had known her mother, then that meant, no, she couldn't let herself go there, not yet. She stood abruptly, running a hand over her face. This is insane! Timothy watched her, but he didn't push. I know, she paced, trying to make sense of it. And what? You just happened to walk into my diner one day. Of all the people in this city, of all the restaurants you could have chosen. She let out a hollow laugh. That's too much of a coincidence. Timothy's expression remained calm, but there was something in his gaze, something steady. I don't believe in coincidences, Christina. She swallowed hard, looking away. She needed time, space, anything to make sense of the storm brewing inside her. Timothy seemed to understand that. He didn't push, didn't demand answers. Instead, he stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. I'm going to look into it, he said quietly. I need to know the truth. Christina closed her eyes, her fists clenched. And what if the truth is something we don't want to hear? There was a pause before Timothy answered. Then we deal with it, together. She didn't know why those words made her chest tighten. Why the idea of together felt so foreign and yet right. She listened as his footsteps echoed across the room, heard the door open and close behind him, and for the first time in a long time, she was truly afraid. Afraid of what they might find, afraid of what it might change. The next morning, Christina woke up feeling like she had barely slept at all. Her mind had raced through the night, replaying every word Timothy had said, every look he had given her. The idea that he had known her mother, that there was even the slightest chance he could be connected to her past, was too much to process. She wanted to dismiss it as a ridiculous coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. After dropping Isaac off at school, she walked aimlessly for a while before finding herself outside the restaurant. It wasn't even open yet, but it had become the place she went when she needed to think. The space was quiet, still filled with the scent of fresh paint and wood polish. She pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing Timothy's number. It barely rang twice before he picked up. I was wondering when you'd call. His voice was calm, steady, but she could hear the same tension she was feeling underneath it. I need answers, she said. There was a pause. So do I. He told her to meet him at his office in an hour. She had never been to his actual place of business before, but she knew it was downtown, in one of the sleek high-rise buildings that loomed over the city like glass fortresses. When she arrived, the sheer luxury of the place nearly made her turn around. She didn't belong here, but then again, if Timothy was right about everything, maybe she did. A woman in a sharp gray suit greeted her the moment she stepped off the elevator. Miss Carter, Christina nodded. Mr. Williams is expecting you. The office was enormous. All floor-to-ceiling windows and dark wood. Timothy stood by one of the windows, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city below. When he turned to face her, there was something unreadable in his eyes. I had my investigator run a search last night, he said without preamble. I didn't want to waste time. Christina's stomach twisted. And, he gestured to the desk. There were papers laid out, documents, old records, and a photograph. She stepped forward, her breath catching when she saw it. It was an old photo, slightly faded at the edges. A younger Timothy, maybe in his early 20s, stood with his arm around a woman. A beautiful woman with warm brown eyes and a soft smile. Christina's knees nearly buckled. She had seen that face before. It was the same face that looked back at her from an old, weathered picture frame on her nightstand. Her mother, and Timothy. Together. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. "Where did you get this?" Timothy's voice was quiet. "It was in my old records, from when I was just starting out, before everything changed." Christina's vision blurred. "This isn't possible. She never told you about me?" Timothy asked. Christina shook her head. "She barely spoke about my father at all. She just said he wasn't around, that he never even knew I existed." Timothy's jaw tightened. "I didn't." Christina's breath came in shallow gasps. Everything in her life, everything she thought she knew, was shifting beneath her feet. "She left," Timothy continued, his voice laced with something raw. Regret, maybe. "One day she was just gone. I searched for her, but she never left a trace. I thought she had moved on, that she wanted nothing to do with me." He exhaled sharply. "But if she was pregnant, if she had you," the weight of it crushed her. She wasn't just some stranger Timothy had stumbled upon. She was his daughter. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest. This doesn't change anything," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying to herself. Timothy's gaze softened. "Christina, it changes everything." She shook her head violently. No, I don't need this. I don't need a father." She flinched at the word. Timothy's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like she was seeing him for the first time. Not as the billionaire, not as the man who had walked into her life with an offer too good to be true, but as someone who had lost something, someone who had just realized that he had a daughter he never knew existed, and she had just realized she had a father. Her vision blurred again, but this time, she turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "I need to go. Christina, I need time." She barely heard his response as she rushed out of the office, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. By the time she reached the street, she was gasping for breath. She had spent her whole life believing she was alone, that the only family she had left was Isaac. But now, Timothy Williams was standing in front of her, telling her that she had been wrong, that she wasn't alone, that she had never been alone. Christina spent the rest of the day wandering through the city, trying to make sense of the storm in her mind. The discovery had cracked something inside her, a foundation she hadn't realized was fragile until now. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone in the world, that her father had been nothing more than a ghost, someone who had disappeared before she was even born. And now, out of nowhere, she had a father, a man who wasn't just a name or a fleeting memory, but someone real, someone who had been searching for the same answers, only to find them in the most unexpected way. She didn't know how to feel about it. The hurt came first. The thought that her mother had kept this from her all these years. Had she been protecting her, or had she been afraid? The questions gnawed at her, each one heavier than the last. By the time she made it back home, her body ached from walking, but her mind was nowhere near exhausted. Isaac was already in his pajamas, sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping through one of his comic books. "Hey, bud," she greeted, forcing a smile as she dropped her keys on the kitchen counter. Isaac looked up and immediately frowned. "Mom, are you okay?" She hesitated. "Yeah, just a long day." His eyes narrowed, clearly not convinced. "Is this about the restaurant?" Christina exhaled, sitting down beside him. "Something like that." Isaac put his book down and turned to her, his small hands resting on his lap. "You always tell me I can talk to you when something's wrong. You can talk to me too, you know." The lump in her throat grew. She reached out, running a hand through his messy curls. "You're too smart for your own good. You know that." He grinned. "I know." Christina swallowed the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. She wasn't even sure how she was supposed to process it herself. But deep down, she knew she couldn't avoid Timothy forever. 2 days passed before she finally mustered the courage to see him again. She told herself she wasn't ready, that she needed more time. But in the end, the pull was too strong, the need for answers greater than the fear keeping her away. She found herself standing outside his office building again, Staring up at the massive glass windows that reflected the sky, taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. This time, she didn't need to check in with the receptionist. As soon as she walked through the doors, Timothy was already there, waiting for her. He must have known she would come. They didn't speak as he led her to his private office, the tension thick between them once inside. Once, he gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Why didn't she tell me?" Christina asked, her voice low but firm. Timothy sighed, rubbing his hand over his face before looking at her. "I don't know." "That's not good enough," she snapped. "You said you searched for her. You said she disappeared, so why? Why would she hide from you? Why would she hide me from you?" Pain flickered across his expression, but he didn't look away. "I wish I had that answer, Christina." Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Christina turned away, her hands shaking. "This changes everything," she whispered. Timothy stood slowly, stepping closer. "I know it does, and I know this isn't easy for you, but I need you to understand something. I never knew about you. If I had, I would have been there." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it, something that made her chest tighten. She believed him, and that scared her even more, because if he had known, if he had been in her life, what would that have meant? Would she have had the father she had always secretly wished for? Would things have been different? Would she have been different? "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Timothy hesitated for only a moment before responding. Then, "Let's figure it out. Together." The word sent a shiver through her. She had spent so long being independent, never relying on anyone but herself. And now, here was this man, this stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all, offering her something she had never thought she would have. A father, a family. She turned back to him, eyes searching his face. "I need time." Timothy nodded. "Take all the time you need." But as she walked out of his office that day, she knew the truth. Time wouldn't change the fact that she couldn't run from this. Not anymore. The truth weighed on Christina like an anchor. No matter how much she tried to focus on the restaurant, on Isaac, on the everyday struggles she was used to facing, she couldn't shake the realization that her life had changed forever. The walls she had spent years building, walls of independence, of resilience, of survival, felt like they were cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of something she never thought she would have. A father. She told herself she needed space, but even as she avoided Timothy's calls, she found herself thinking about him constantly. How many birthdays had passed where he had no idea she existed? How many times had she wished for someone to lean on? Someone to guide her when he had been out there, unaware that she needed him. And what about him? Had he ever wondered about the life he could have had if things had been different? It wasn't fair. None of it was. Lisa was the only person she trusted enough to confide in. One evening, after the restaurant had closed for the night, she invited her over, needing to get everything out before it swallowed her whole. Lisa sat on Christina's couch, listening with wide eyes as she recounted everything. Timothy's revelation, the photograph, the undeniable proof that the man who had walked into her diner weeks ago was the father she had never known. When she finished, Lisa let out a long breath and leaned back against the cushions. "Jesus, Chris, when you said you had a lot going on, I wasn't expecting that." Christina let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, welcome to my life." Lisa shook her head. "And you've just been sitting on this, not talking to him?" Christina sighed. "What am I supposed to say? Hey, so glad you found out you have a daughter. Let's grab a coffee and catch up on 32 years. It's not that simple." Lisa gave her a look. "Maybe it's not. But you do realize that, for the first time in your life, you have a chance to get some real answers. A chance to actually have a family." Christina's stomach twisted. "I have a family. I have Isaac." Lisa nodded. "And maybe now you have more." The words hit harder than Christina wanted to admit. After Lisa left, she sat alone in the quiet apartment, staring at the framed photograph of her mother on the bookshelf. It was the same picture she had always kept close, a younger version of her mother. Smiling softly, unaware of the years that lay ahead, Christina had so many questions, but the one person who could answer them was gone. Did her mother regret never telling her the truth? Had she wanted to, or had she been afraid of what it would mean? Christina closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. She needed to see Timothy. She wasn't ready for answers, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding him. The next morning, she called him. His voice was calm, but she could hear the tension beneath it. He didn't ask where she had been, didn't push for explanations. He simply told her he'd meet her at the restaurant in an hour. When she arrived, she found him already inside, standing near one of the booths, lost in thought. She hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey." Timothy turned, relief flashing across his face. "Hey." For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything between them filling the silence. Then, finally, Christina sat down at the booth, and Timothy followed. She laced her fingers together, staring at them as she spoke. "I don't know how to do this." Timothy exhaled. "Neither do I." She glanced up, meeting his gaze. "Did you love her?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes," Christina swallowed. "Then why did she leave?" Timothy ran a hand through his hair. "I wish I knew. I thought we were building something. But then one day, she was gone. I searched for her, but she never left a trace. If I had known she was pregnant." He shook his head. "I wouldn't have stopped looking." Christina studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. She found none. "I spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a father," she admitted. "Thinking that whoever he was, he didn't want me." Pain flickered in Timothy's expression. "I wanted you. I just didn't know." She looked away, emotions swirling inside her. After a long moment, she finally spoke again. "Isaac doesn't have a grandfather." Timothy inhaled sharply, understanding what she was saying. "He's a good kid," she continued. "He deserves good people in his life." Timothy's voice was quiet. "I'd like to be one of them." Christina let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. For now, it was enough. The weight of everything Christina had learned pressed down on her like an invisible force she couldn't shake. Every moment alone felt suffocating. Every quiet second filled with questions she couldn't answer. She had spent her whole life thinking she knew where she came from, that her past was simply a series of struggles her mother had endured alone. And now, in the span of a few days, that entire foundation had cracked. Timothy was her father. It still felt surreal. The knowledge sat in the back of her mind no matter how much she tried to ignore it, creeping into her thoughts at unexpected moments. He had searched for her mother. He had never known she existed. He claimed he would have been there if he had, but that didn't change the fact that he hadn't been there, and that fact was the hardest one to accept. She had told herself she would take it slow, that she would let this unfold in a way that made sense. But the truth was, nothing about this made sense. Timothy, on the other hand, was patient. He didn't push, didn't demand anything from her, but he was present in a way she wasn't used to. He called to check on her, stopped by the restaurant without warning, found small ways to insert himself into her world without forcing himself in. At first, she had bristled at the attention, but over time, she found herself expecting it. One evening, after another long day at the restaurant, she was locking up when she saw his car parked across the street. At first, she thought she was imagining things, exhaustion playing tricks on her, but then the headlights flicked on, and she realized he had been waiting for her. She sighed, gripping the strap of her bag before walking over to him. "You always just happen to be around, don't you?" Timothy leaned against the car door, arms crossed. "I figured you could use a ride home." Christina raised an eyebrow. "And you assume I don't have a way home?" Timothy smirked. "I assume you're exhausted and that taking the train sounds miserable." She hated that he was right. With a tired sigh, she pulled the door open and slid into the passenger seat. The car smelled of leather and faint cologne, clean and expensive, a stark contrast to the life she was used to. She folded her arms across her chest as Timothy started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space between them. They drove in silence for a while, the city lights flickering past, casting long shadows across the dashboard. Christina stared out the window, watching as pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, lost in their own lives. It felt strange, knowing that just days ago, she had been one of them, someone completely unaware that her past was about to change forever. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Timothy's voice broke through the quiet. Christina didn't turn to look at him. "I don't know how not to," Timothy exhaled, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Neither do I. Christina finally glanced at him, noting the tension in his jaw. He looked deep in thought, almost troubled. Did you love her? She asked. Timothy's grip on the wheel remained firm, but his expression softened. Yes, I did. The honesty in his voice took her by surprise. She had expected hesitation, maybe even avoidance, but there was none. She swallowed, trying to make sense of it all. Then why did she leave? That's the part I still don't understand. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. She never talked about you, Christina admitted. Not once. I asked about my father when I was younger, but she always shut down the conversation. She made it seem like he didn't want me. Timothy's jaw clenched. I would have wanted you, if I had known. She studied him, searching for any hint of deception, but found none. It hurt, hearing those words, knowing they were true, and knowing that it didn't change the past. I spent my whole life believing I wasn't wanted, she said quietly, that I had no one but myself. Timothy's gaze softened. You were wanted, Christina, more than you know. Her throat tightened, and she turned away, staring out the window again. After a few minutes, she sighed. Did you ever want kids? Timothy hesitated. I think I did, a long time ago, but life has a way of pushing certain things aside. She nodded, understanding that more than she cared to admit. The car slowed as they reached her apartment. Timothy pulled up to the curb, shifting the car into park, but neither of them moved to get out. Christina finally turned to him. I don't know what you expect from me. Timothy met her gaze. I don't expect anything. I just want the chance to be here. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to decide everything right now. His voice was steady, reassuring. Just take it one step at a time. She looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of everything pressing against her chest. Finally, she nodded. Okay. Timothy nodded as well, as if understanding how much that one word meant. She stepped out of the car and shut the door behind her, but as she walked toward her building, she hesitated before turning back. Timothy was still there, watching, waiting, and for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted him to leave. The days that followed were marked by an unspoken understanding between Christina and Timothy. She still didn't know what to make of this newfound connection, but she had stopped running from it. She didn't return every call or text immediately, but she answered. She didn't invite him into every part of her life, but she let him in, little by little. Isaac, unaware of the complexities swirling around them, had taken a liking to Timothy almost instantly. Christina hadn't told him the truth yet. Wasn't sure how or when she would, but something about their dynamic felt natural. It was effortless, like Timothy had always been meant to be part of their world. One evening, after picking Isaac up from school, she found him sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping through an old photo album she hadn't seen in years. His small fingers traced over the images of her mother, of a younger Christina, of the life they had lived before everything changed. Mom, Isaac looked up, curiosity in his eyes. Do you have any pictures of Grandpa? The question sent a sharp pang through her chest. She hesitated, forcing a tight smile. I don't, Bud. Isaac frowned. Did you ever meet him? Christina swallowed hard, her throat tightening. No, it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Isaac nodded slowly, as if trying to make sense of it. I think it'd be cool to have a grandpa. Christina's heart twisted. She reached over, ruffling his hair. Yeah, she said softly. It would. That night, after putting Isaac to bed, she found herself staring at her phone. Timothy's number already pulled up on the screen. She didn't know why she called. Maybe it was Isaac's words still lingering in her mind, or maybe she was just tired of avoiding the inevitable. The phone barely rang twice before he answered. Christina. His voice was steady, calm, but she could hear the surprise in it. She took a deep breath. Are you busy? A pause. Never too busy for you. She hesitated, fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Do you want to meet for coffee? Silence stretched between them for a moment, but when he spoke again, his voice was softer. I'd like that. They met at a quiet cafe the next morning, the kind of place Christina wouldn't have expected to find Timothy in. It was small, cozy, tucked away on a side street where the scent of fresh pastries and espresso filled the air when she walked in. He was already there, seated at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw her, his expression unreadable but welcoming. She sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug the barista had placed in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Timothy leaned forward slightly. "I wasn't sure if you'd call," Christina exhaled, staring down at the dark liquid in her cup. "Neither was I." He nodded, as if understanding. "But you did." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Isaac asked about his grandfather last night." Timothy stilled, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "I told him I never met my father, that I didn't have any pictures of him." She let out a breath. "I didn't lie, but I didn't tell him the truth either." Timothy's voice was gentle. "You don't have to rush it." Christina shook her head. "I don't even know how to tell him. How do I explain to a 10-year-old that the man who just walked into our lives is someone I didn't even know existed until a few weeks ago?" Timothy was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Tell him the truth, that life is complicated, that sometimes things don't happen the way they should, but that doesn't mean they can't still be good." She studied him, searching for something in his face that she wasn't even sure she could define. "You make it sound so simple." He offered a small, rueful smile. "It's not, but I meant what I said before. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect you to change everything overnight. I just want to be here," Christina sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've spent my whole life figuring things out on my own. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to need someone." Timothy's expression softened. "Needing someone doesn't make you weak, Christina." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to believe that, but needing someone meant trusting them. It meant letting them in, letting them matter, and that was terrifying. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth ground her. "I don't know where to go from here." Timothy nodded. "Then let's figure it out together." The words settled in her chest. Not heavy like she had expected, but strangely light. For the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. For years, Christina had been used to doing things on her own. She had never relied on anyone but herself, never expected help from anyone. Every challenge, every burden, every moment of uncertainty, she had faced it alone. And now, suddenly, there was someone standing beside her. Someone who, by all accounts, should have been a stranger. Someone who, despite the years of absence, had stepped into her life as though he belonged there. It still didn't feel real. Timothy's presence was steady, but never intrusive. He didn't demand space in her life. He simply existed in it, showing up in small but meaningful ways. Like now, standing next to her on the sidelines of a soccer field, watching Isaac play his heart out, as if this was something they had always done together. The sky stretched wide above them, a clear, crisp blue. Parents lined the field, their voices mixing with the excited shouts of children chasing the ball across the grass. Christina stood with her arms crossed, her eyes on the game, though her thoughts were tangled elsewhere. "You know, he's not as good as he thinks he is," she murmured. Timothy, standing beside her with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, smirked. "Confidence is half the battle." She huffed a quiet laugh. Try telling him that. Isaac had always been a dreamer, someone who believed in his abilities without hesitation. That was something she had encouraged, even if it sometimes led to an overinflated sense of accomplishment. He saw the world through big, bold colors, unafraid to reach for things that seemed impossible. Timothy tilted his head slightly, watching the game with quiet amusement. "It's a good trait," he said. "Most people lose that as they grow up." Christina glanced at him. "Did you?" A shadow flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "At some point, yeah," she didn't press. The game continued, Isaac running up and down the field with an energy only a 10-year-old could have. He wasn't the best player out there, but he was determined, and that alone set him apart. When halftime arrived, he sprinted toward them, his face flushed with excitement. "You came," he said, his gaze locked onto Timothy. Timothy nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." Isaac studied him for a moment, as if assessing something. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "Well, good, because I'm about to score the winning goal." Christina rolled her eyes. "Don't get ahead of yourself." Timothy smirked. "Confidence is key." Isaac nodded firmly, as if that settled everything. Exactly. Then he turned and dashed back onto the field, already shouting for his teammates. Christina folded her arms, shaking her head. You do realize you just encouraged him? Right, Timothy chuckled. He seems like the kind of kid who doesn't need much encouragement. She exhaled, but there was a warmth in her chest she couldn't quite explain. When the game resumed, Isaac played with even more determination, dodging defenders, chasing the ball like it was the most important thing in the world. And then, the moment came. He took the shot, the ball sailing past the goalie and landing squarely in the net. A loud cheer erupted from the sidelines. Isaac turned, arms raised in triumph, grinning like he had just won a championship. Christina clapped, laughter bubbling up despite herself. Timothy, beside her, let out a low whistle. Not bad, he remarked. Isaac sprinted over, still breathless. Did you see that? Christina ruffled his hair. You did great, kid. Isaac turned to Timothy, eyes bright. What do you think? Timothy nodded. That was impressive, Isaac beamed. Told you. Christina rolled her eyes. But she couldn't hide her smile. As the field emptied, and the teams gathered for their final huddle, Christina and Timothy waited on the sidelines. The warmth of the late afternoon sun pressed against her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Contentment. Timothy glanced at her. He's a great kid. Christina nodded, watching Isaac interact with his teammates, still buzzing from his goal. Yeah, he is. A pause. You did a good job with him. Christina swallowed. She wasn't used to hearing that. She had spent years second-guessing herself, wondering if she was doing enough, if she was being enough. Thanks, she said quietly. They watched in silence as the team dispersed, parents gathering their kids, conversations blending together in the background. As they walked back to the car, Isaac talking animatedly about his goal. Christina glanced at Timothy again. He caught her gaze, and in that moment, she saw something there, something she wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. A connection, a quiet understanding. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, letting him in wouldn't be so bad after all. The car ride home was filled with Isaac's excited chatter, his voice bubbling with energy as he replayed every moment of the game in vivid detail. Christina listened, occasionally chiming in with a teasing remark or nodding along as he spoke, but her mind was elsewhere. Timothy drove with the same quiet ease he always carried himself with, his focus split between the road and the conversation happening in the back seat. Christina stole glances at him from the passenger side, still trying to wrap her mind around the fact that this man, this stranger who had walked into her life only weeks ago, was her father. And now, here he was, driving her and her son home, as if this was just another Saturday, as they pulled up in front of the apartment. Isaac unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward between the two front seats. Hey, Timothy. Timothy turned slightly. Yeah. Isaac hesitated for a second, biting his lip. You want to come inside? Christina's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that. Timothy's gaze flickered to her, searching her face for permission. She wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't that she didn't want him to come inside. It was that everything felt like it was happening so fast, like she was losing control over the way her life had always been. Isaac, oblivious to the weight of the moment, bounced slightly on his heels. Come on, I can show you my soccer trophies. Timothy let out a soft chuckle. You've got trophies. Not from today's game, Isaac admitted, but from my other teams, and I have one for being the most enthusiastic player, which basically means I try the hardest. Christina let out a small laugh despite herself. It means he talks the most. Isaac shot her a look before turning back to Timothy. So, you coming? Timothy met Christina's gaze again. She knew he was waiting for her to say something, to either invite him in or give him an excuse to leave. She let out a slow breath. Yeah, come in. Isaac beamed and practically flew out of the car. Christina stepped out more slowly, her stomach tightening with nerves she didn't quite understand. Inside, the apartment was the same as always, modest but warm, the kind of place Christina had worked hard to make feel like home. The living room was cluttered with Isaac's belongings, comic books stacked in the corner, a few stray soccer balls near the door. A framed photo of Christina's mother sat on a shelf, watching over the space like a quiet guardian. Timothy took it all in without a word, his sharp eyes scanning the room like he was memorizing every detail. "Okay, wait here," Isaac announced before darting into his room. "I'm gonna get my trophies." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Christina and Timothy standing awkwardly in the middle of the living room. She cleared her throat. "Sorry about the mess." Timothy shook his head. "It's not a mess, it looks lived in." She folded her arms, studying him. "You expected something different." He met her gaze. "No, but it's nice to see a part of your world." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, Isaac burst back into the room, holding 3 small trophies and a handful of medals. "Look." He practically shoved them into Timothy's hands. Timothy chuckled, inspecting one of the trophies. "Most enthusiastic player, huh? That's an important award." Isaac nodded vigorously. "Yeah, it means I never give up." Timothy's expression softened, something flickering in his eyes. "That's a good trait to have." Isaac grinned, clearly pleased with the approval. "I think I'm gonna get a real MVP trophy next season." "I don't doubt it," Timothy said. Christina stood off to the side, watching the interaction unfold. It was strange, seeing them together like this. Isaac had never had a grandfather figure in his life, never had someone outside of her who took an interest in him like this. And Timothy, for all his wealth and power, seemed completely at ease sitting on the couch with a 10-year-old. Listening to him talk about his soccer aspirations, it was nice, and that terrified her. She wasn't used to having someone else there, wasn't used to sharing these moments. But as she looked at Timothy, she realized something. He wasn't trying to take over. He was just trying to be there. Isaac launched into another story about a game-winning goal he had almost scored last season. And Timothy listened, nodding along as if it were the most important thing in the world. Christina turned away for a moment, letting out a slow breath. She had spent so long believing she didn't need anyone, and maybe she didn't. But for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to let someone stay. For the rest of the evening, Christina watched Timothy and Isaac interact, each moment feeling more surreal than the last. It was like stepping into an alternate version of her life, one where her son had a grandfather, where there was someone else in the room who wasn't just passing through but actually staying. Isaac was in his element, talking Timothy's ear off about soccer, comic books, and his school projects. Timothy listened to every word, nodding, asking questions, laughing in the right places. It wasn't forced, it wasn't awkward. It was natural in a way Christina hadn't expected. At one point, Isaac ran to his room, determined to find an old drawing he had made of his dream soccer stadium. The moment he disappeared down the hall, Timothy leaned back slightly on the couch, looking over at Christina. "He's an incredible kid," he said softly. Christina swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, he is." Timothy hesitated before continuing. "You've done a good job raising him." She didn't know why those words hit her the way they did. Maybe because she hadn't heard them often. Maybe because no one had ever really seen how hard she worked to make sure Isaac had everything he needed. She let out a breath. "I tried. Still trying." Timothy studied her, his expression unreadable. "You did more than try. You did it." She looked away, focusing on the coffee table, the small stack of Isaac's books, the framed picture of her mother that sat on the shelf nearby. There were so many things she wanted to ask him, so many things she had been afraid to say. But sitting here now, in this small apartment that had been her whole world for so long, she finally found the courage. "Why did you stop looking for her?" she asked quietly. Timothy didn't answer right away. When she looked back at him, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Regret. "I never stopped," he admitted. "Not really." Christina frowned. "But you said—" "I searched for her for years," he interrupted gently. "I hired people. I followed every lead I could find, but it was like she had vanished. Eventually, I convinced myself she didn't want to be found." Christina's throat tightened. Timothy exhaled. "But if I had known about you—" He shook his head. "I wouldn't have given up." She wanted to believe him, and maybe, deep down, she already did. Before she could respond, Isaac came running back into the room, a worn piece of paper in his hands. Okay, look." He shoved the drawing at Timothy, beaming. "This is my dream stadium. It has a retractable roof, a snack bar with unlimited hot dogs, and a section just for kids to play while their parents watch the game." Timothy took the drawing, examining it like it was a blueprint for a billion-dollar project. "This is impressive," he said seriously. Isaac nodded. "Right. I was thinking, maybe when I grow up I could build it for real." Timothy smiled. "I think you could." Isaac beamed, his excitement practically radiating off him. Christina watched the exchange, something shifting inside her. It wasn't just that Timothy was here. It was that he cared, and not in a distant, detached way, but in a way that mattered. For the first time, she let herself wonder, what would it be like to let him stay, to let Isaac have this? She had spent so long shielding her son from disappointment, from the pain of expecting something that might never come. But Timothy wasn't walking away, and maybe he never would. As the evening stretched on, Christina found herself easing into the rhythm of it. The conversation flowed, laughter filled the space, and for a little while, everything felt right. When Timothy finally stood to leave, Isaac frowned. "Are you sure you don't want to stay longer?" Timothy smiled. "I'll come back soon." Isaac grinned. "Okay, but don't take too long." Timothy glanced at Christina then, something unreadable in his eyes. "I won't." Christina walked him to the door, lingering in the threshold as he stepped outside. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the night air crisp around them. Then Timothy spoke. "I know this isn't easy for you." She swallowed. "No, it's not. I won't rush you," he said. "But I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere." Christina looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she believed it. She exhaled, nodding. "Good night, Timothy." He smiled. "Good night, Christina." As she closed the door behind him, she let out a slow breath. She wasn't ready for everything this meant, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to try.